The cold, unforgiving winds of Colorado Territory swept through the dusty streets of Leadville as Abigail Parker stumbled through her back door, blood trickling from her split lip. The year was 1879, and like the silver veins that ran beneath the town's rugged terrain, violence and opportunity flowed in equal measure through its burgeoning streets. "You ain't going nowhere," growled a voice behind her. Abigail felt rough fingers twist into her long chestnut hair before she could reach the safety of the alley. Her husband, Frank Parker, yanked her backward with such force that she lost her footing, tumbling onto the hard, packed earth. "Please," she gasped, her breath coming in short, painful bursts. "Frank, you're hurting me." "Hurting you?" Frank sneered, his whiskey-soured breath hot against her face as he dragged her up by her hair. "You ain't seen nothing yet, woman. Think you can embarrass me in front of the whole saloon?" She had done nothing but accidentally spill a drink while serving customers at the Silver Dollar, where she'd been working to keep food on their table. But Frank, drunk and bitter about his latest failed mining venture, saw only a wife who disrespected him. "I'll teach you your place," he snarled, dragging her by her hair toward the main street. Abigail clawed at his hands, feeling strands of hair tear from her scalp as her worn boots kicked up dust. Townsfolk stopped to stare, but none intervened. Domestic matters were private affairs in Leadville, even when they spilled into public view. Frank threw her down in the middle of the street, raising his hand for a blow that everyone knew was coming. Abigail raised her arms to protect her face, a whimper escaping her lips as she braced for the impact. "That's enough." The voice cut through the tension like a knife. Low and dangerous, it came from a tall figure who stepped out from the shadow of the general store. His spurs clinked against the hard earth as he approached, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Mind your business, stranger," Frank spat, not bothering to look at the man who'd spoken. "I'm making it my business." The stranger's hand rested casually on the revolver at his hip. "Let her go." Frank finally turned, sizing up the newcomer with bloodshot eyes. The man stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and eyes the color of steel beneath the brim of his weathered hat. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, marking him as someone who took pride in himself despite the hardships of the frontier. "Who the hell are you to tell me how to handle my wife?" Frank demanded, yanking Abigail up by her arm. She cried out in pain. In one fluid motion, the stranger drew his pistol, the action so quick it seemed to happen in the space between heartbeats. He didn't point it at Frank, just held it at his side, hammer cocked, a silent promise of what would follow. "My name's Ethan Ingram," he said calmly. "And you're going to let that woman go right now." Frank's grip tightened, and Abigail felt her arm might snap. But something in Ethan's eyes must have convinced him, for he shoved her away with disgust. She stumbled but managed to keep her feet beneath her this time. "This ain't over," Frank muttered, looking from his wife to the stranger. Ethan took a step forward. "Touch her again," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the still air, "and I'll bury you." The threat hung between them, as real and solid as the mountains that loomed over Leadville. Frank's face contorted with rage, but the alcohol in his blood made him just sober enough to recognize the death in Ethan's eyes. Without another word, he spat on the ground and stalked off toward the nearest saloon. Abigail stood trembling in the street, painfully aware of the stares from onlookers who were already drifting back to their business. The entertainment concluded. She straightened her torn dress with shaking hands, trying to recover some dignity. "Thank you," she said quietly as Ethan approached, holstering his weapon. "But you shouldn't have done that. He'll be worse when he comes home tonight." Ethan's expression softened, revealing a face younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with lines etched by sun and hardship rather than age. "Do you have somewhere safe to go, madam?" Abigail laughed bitterly. "In Leadville, for a woman with no family. There's the brothel or the street, and I've managed to avoid both so far." "There's Mrs. Wilson's boarding house," Ethan suggested, nodding toward a respectable-looking building at the end of the street. "I passed it on my way into town." "I can't afford, I'll pay," he said simply. When she began to protest, he added, "Consider it a loan if your pride demands it, but you need somewhere safe tonight." Abigail studied him, searching for ulterior motives in those gray eyes. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "A loan, then. I'll pay you back." Together they walked toward Mrs. Wilson's establishment, maintaining a proper distance between them that nonetheless scandalized several passing ladies. Abigail ignored them. After 3 years of marriage to Frank Parker, her reputation in Leadville was already tarnished beyond salvaging. "Are you passing through?" she asked, noticing the dust of the trail still clinging to Ethan's boots. "Was planning to stay a while," he replied. "There's work in the mines for a man willing to break his back, I hear." "There is," she confirmed. "Though many come with dreams of silver and leave with nothing but broken bodies and empty pockets." "I'm not chasing silver," Ethan said. "Just honest work. At the boarding house, Mrs. Wilson, a stern widow with kind eyes that belied her rigid posture, took one look at Abigail's bruised face and torn dress and ushered her inside without comment. Ethan paid for a week in advance, tipping his hat to both women before turning to leave. "Mr. Ingram," Abigail called after him. When he turned back, she found herself suddenly wordless. What could she say to this stranger who'd risked his life for hers? "Be careful of Frank. He doesn't forget a slight." Ethan's mouth curved into a smile that transformed his weather-beaten face. "I reckon I can handle Frank Parker, madam. You just concentrate on taking care of yourself." As he walked away, Abigail felt something stir within her that she hadn't experienced in years' hope. It was dangerous and probably foolish, but as Mrs. Wilson led her to a small but clean room with an actual lock on the door, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her life wasn't predestined to end beneath Frank's fists after all. Ethan Ingram found lodging at the miners' boarding house on the edge of town, a rough establishment filled with men who smelled of earth and dynamite. Over a simple supper of beans and cornbread, he listened to the talk around him, gathering information about Leadville and its inhabitants. "Parker's a mean drunk," confirmed a grizzled miner when Ethan casually asked about the man. "Used to be a decent prospector till he started believing his own tall tales. Now he spends more time at the bottom dollar than in his claim." "And his wife?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone neutral. The miner shrugged. "Pretty thing. Too good for him, if you ask me. Works at the Silver Dollar serving drinks. Decent place, not like them dance halls down the way." Ethan nodded, committing this to memory. He hadn't planned on getting involved in a domestic dispute his first day in Leadville. But something about the woman's quiet dignity, despite her circumstances, had struck a chord within him. The next morning, Ethan secured work with a mining crew, his experience from the California goldfields serving him well. The labor was backbreaking, the air in the tunnels thick with dust that coated the lungs and turned men old before their time. But the pay was fair, and no one asked questions about his past. For 3 days he worked, ate, and slept, avoiding the saloons and keeping to himself. On the 4th evening, as he walked back from the mine, he spotted Abigail outside the Silver Dollar, emptying a bucket of water into the street. Her face was healing, the bruises faded to a yellowish tint that she'd covered with face powder. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly pinned up, the very picture of respectability despite her place of employment. She looked up as he approached, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Mr. Ingram," she greeted him with a nod. "Mrs. Parker," he returned. "How are you faring?" "Better, thanks to you." She glanced around nervously. "Frank's been looking for you. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you disrespected him." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I expected as much." Abigail bit her lip. "I'd like to repay you for the boarding house. I've saved a little." "Keep your money," he said. "You might need it." Her eyes flashed with something pride, perhaps. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Ingram." "It wasn't charity," he replied. "It was the right thing to do." Before she could respond, the saloon's batwing doors swung open and the barkeeper called out, "Abigail, customers waiting." "I need to go," she said, turning to leave. "When do you finish?" Ethan asked suddenly. She hesitated. "Midnight. But I'll walk you back to Mrs. Wilson's." Abigail stared at him. "That's not necessary." "Maybe not," he conceded, "but I'd sleep better knowing you got home safe." A small smile touched her lips, transforming her face. "Very well, Mr. Ingram. Midnight." True to his word, Ethan was waiting outside the Silver Dollar when Abigail finished her shift. The late September air had a bite to it, and he noticed she had only a thin shawl for warmth. Without a word, he shrugged off his coat and placed it around her shoulders. "I can't take this," she protested. "Just till we reach Mrs. Wilson's," he said. "I run hot anyway." They walked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sound the distant piano from the saloons and the occasional shout of a drunken miner. Leadville never truly slept, the round-the-clock operations at the mines ensuring there was always someone beginning or ending a shift. "How long have you been married?" Ethan asked finally. Abigail's face tightened. 3 years. It wasn't always like this. "Frank was kind once, or at least I thought he was. We came from Missouri with such dreams." "Dreams have a way of turning sour out here," Ethan observed. "Yes," she agreed softly, "but new ones can grow in their place, can't they?" Before he could respond, a figure lurched from an alleyway ahead of them. Frank Parker, swaying on his feet but with murder in his eyes, blocked their path. "Well, well," he slurred. "Ain't this cozy? My wife and the man who threatened to kill me taking a midnight stroll." Ethan positioned himself slightly in front of Abigail. "Go home, Parker. You're drunk." Frank ignored him, focusing on his wife. "Didn't take you long to find another man's bed, did it, Abby? Always knew you were nothing but that's enough." Ethan cut him off, his voice dangerously quiet. "Mrs. Parker works hard and deserves respect. Now step aside." Instead, Frank reached inside his coat and pulled out a knife, the blade catching the moonlight. "I'm gonna cut you, Cowboy, and then I'm gonna teach my wife what happens to women who forget their vows." Ethan didn't draw his gun. In close quarters with a drunk man, things could go wrong too quickly. Instead, he waited as Frank lunged forward with the knife, sidestepping the clumsy attack and delivering a precise blow to Frank's wrist that sent the weapon clattering to the ground. Frank howled in pain but came back swinging wildly. Ethan deflected most of the blows, landing a solid punch to Frank's midsection that doubled him over. When Frank straightened, blood trickled from his nose, his eyes unfocused. "Stay down," Ethan advised him. But Frank, fueled by alcohol and humiliation, charged again. This time, Ethan met him with a right hook that connected with Frank's jaw, dropping him unconscious to the dirt. Ethan turned to Abigail, who stood wide-eyed but unafraid. "Are you all right?" She nodded, looking at her husband's still form. "You didn't kill him?" "No," Ethan said, "but he might wish I had when he wakes up." They continued to Mrs. Wilson's in silence, both aware that the confrontation had changed things between them. At the door, Abigail returned his coat, her fingers brushing against his. "Thank you," she said. Again, Ethan nodded. "Lock your door tonight." As he turned to leave, she called after him softly. Mr. Ingram, he looked back. I work at the Silver Dollar every evening except Sundays, she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, in case you ever want a hot meal or a cup of coffee. He tipped his hat, a smile tugging at his lips. I might just take you up on that, Mrs. Parker. The next morning, Sheriff Thomas Harrington paid a visit to the miners' boarding house, finding Ethan just finishing his breakfast. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor that had kept Leadville's rougher elements somewhat in check during the silver boom. Hear you had some trouble with Frank Parker last night, the sheriff said without preamble, settling his considerable bulk onto the bench across from Ethan. Self-defense, Ethan replied calmly. He came at me with a knife. The sheriff nodded. That's how I heard it from Mrs. Wilson. She saw the whole thing from her window. He studied Ethan with shrewd eyes. Parker's making noise about pressing charges, but I told him he'd be the one in a cell if he did. Man's a menace when he drinks, which is most of the time these days. I appreciate that, Sheriff. Don't, Harrington said bluntly. I'm not doing you any favors, just keeping the peace. He leaned forward. But I will tell you this: getting between a man and his wife in this town is a quick way to find yourself dead or gone. You understand? Ethan met the sheriff's gaze steadily. I understand the law, Sheriff. Do you understand that the law is supposed to protect everyone, including wives from husbands who beat them? A flicker of something shame, perhaps, crossed Harrington's face. The law has its limits out here, son. I can't be everywhere. Neither can I, Ethan acknowledged, but I'll be where I need to be. The sheriff sighed heavily as he stood. You seem like a decent man, Ingram. I'd hate to see you get killed over someone else's troubles. He adjusted his gun belt. Parker's been talking big at the bottom dollar. Says he's going to settle things with you once and for all. Thought you should know. After the sheriff left, Ethan went about his day as usual, descending into the earth with the other miners, the constant threat of cave-ins and suffocation, a more immediate concern than Frank Parker's threats. But as he worked, he found his thoughts repeatedly returning to Abigail, her quiet strength, the fleeting smile that transformed her face, the way she'd stood her ground despite everything. That evening, instead of returning to the boarding house for supper, Ethan cleaned up as best he could and made his way to the Silver Dollar. The saloon was a cut above the rougher establishments that lined Harrison Avenue, catering to mine supervisors and merchants rather than common laborers. A polished bar ran along one wall, tables filled the center of the room, and a small stage at the back featured a man playing a slightly out-of-tune piano. Abigail spotted him the moment he entered. She was carrying a tray of drinks to a table of card players, but managed a small nod of acknowledgement. Ethan found an empty table in the corner and waited, content to observe the room and its occupants. When she approached his table, her professional smile warmed into something more genuine. Mr. Ingram, what can I get you? Coffee if you have it, he replied, and whatever's hot from the kitchen. Beef stew tonight, she informed him. It's actually quite good. Then stew it is. She hesitated, glancing around the busy saloon. About last night, no need to talk about it, Ethan assured her. Abigail nodded gratefully and hurried off to fetch his order. When she returned with the coffee, she set it down carefully. Frank didn't come home last night. Word is he's been drinking at the bottom dollar since this morning. The sheriff mentioned he's been making threats, Ethan said, taking a sip of the surprisingly decent coffee. Worry creased her brow. He's dangerous when he's like this, more to himself than others usually, but I can handle Frank Parker, Ethan assured her. That's what worries me, Abigail confessed. I don't want you hurt because of me. Before he could respond, she was called away to serve another table. For the next hour, Ethan ate his stew, which was indeed quite good, and watched Abigail move efficiently through the saloon. Despite the occasional leer from a customer, she maintained an air of dignity that commanded respect from most of the patrons. As the evening wore on, the saloon grew more crowded and rowdy. Ethan nursed his coffee, turning down offers from the bartender to put something stronger in that cup. He was about to leave when the batwing doors crashed open, and Frank Parker stumbled in, followed by three rough-looking men Ethan recognized from the bottom dollar. The piano player faltered as conversations died away. Frank's bleary gaze swept the room until it landed on Ethan. "There he is," Frank slurred, pointing an unsteady finger. "The man who's been sleeping with my wife." Ethan set down his cup slowly, aware that every eye in the place was now on him. "You're drunk, Parker. Go home before you say something you can't take back." Frank laughed, an ugly sound. "Too late for that, ain't it? Everyone knows Abigail's been warming your bed. Hell, half the men in this room have probably had a turn." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the saloon. Whatever Frank's grievances, most of the patrons knew Abigail as a hardworking, decent woman. Abigail herself stood frozen by the bar, her face pale but her chin high. The owner of the silver dollar, a burly man named Maxwell, moved protectively to her side. "You're not welcome here, Parker," Maxwell called out. "Take your friends and go." Frank ignored him, taking an unsteady step toward Ethan's table. "Get up," he demanded. "Let's settle this like men." Ethan remained seated. "There's nothing to settle. Go home and sleep it off." "Coward," Frank spat. "Hiding behind my wife's skirts." One of Frank's companions, a bull-necked man with a scar across his cheek, moved forward. "Come on, Cowboy. Frank here says you've been disrespecting him. We don't like men who don't show proper respect." Ethan sighed, pushing back his chair and standing. "I don't want trouble." "Should have thought of that before you stole another man's wife," Frank sneered. "I didn't steal anyone," Ethan replied evenly. "Mrs. Parker is her own woman, and she deserves better than a husband who drags her through the street by her hair." Frank's face contorted with rage. "You son of a—" He lunged forward, but his foot caught on a chair leg, sending him sprawling to the floor. The saloon erupted in laughter. Humiliated, Frank scrambled to his feet and drew a pistol from his belt. Immediately, the laughter died. "Not so smug now, are you?" Frank said, leveling the gun at Ethan. Ethan didn't move for his own weapon. "Put it down, Frank. You don't want to hang for murder." "Frank," Abigail's voice cut through the tension as she stepped forward. "Please, this has gone far enough." Frank's aim wavered as he turned toward his wife. "You," he growled. "This is all your fault, always has been." In that moment of distraction, Ethan moved, covering the distance between them in two long strides. He grabbed Frank's wrist, forcing the gun upward as it discharged, the bullet splintering the ceiling. With his other hand, Ethan delivered a powerful blow to Frank's solar plexus that sent him gasping to his knees, the gun clattering from his grip. Frank's three companions started forward, but the click of Maxwell's shotgun being cocked froze them in their tracks. "That's enough," Maxwell barked. "Get him out of here before I let the sheriff deal with this." The men hesitated, looking from the shotgun to their fallen friend. Finally, the scarred man nodded. "Come on, Frank, let's go." They hauled Frank to his feet, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "This ain't over," he wheezed at Ethan. "Not by a long shot." After they dragged Frank out, the saloon gradually returned to its normal state of controlled chaos, though many patrons cast curious glances at Ethan and Abigail. Maxwell approached them, shotgun now lowered but still in hand. "Mrs. Parker, perhaps you should take the rest of the night off," he suggested gently. "With pay, of course." Abigail looked ready to protest but then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Maxwell, and you," Maxwell turned to Ethan. "I appreciate you not turning my place into a shooting gallery, but I'd be obliged if you'd escort Mrs. Parker home and then make yourself scarce for a few days. Bad for business, this kind of excitement." Ethan nodded his understanding. He waited as Abigail collected her shawl and belongings, then followed her out into the cool night air. They walked in silence for several minutes, the tension of the confrontation still hanging between them. "I'm sorry," Abigail said finally, "for all of this, for dragging you into my problems." Ethan shook his head. "You didn't drag me anywhere, Mrs. Parker. I made my own choices." "Abigail," she said softly, "please call me Abigail. After all this, Mrs. Parker feels wrong somehow." "Abigail," he repeated, liking the way her name felt on his lips. "I'm Ethan." They shared a small smile, a moment of connection amid the chaos of their circumstances. When they reached Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, Abigail hesitated at the door. "Would you like to come in for tea?" she asked. "Mrs. Wilson allows callers in the parlor until 9 o'clock." Ethan glanced at the windows, where several curious faces quickly disappeared behind curtains. "I think I've given the good ladies of the boarding house enough to gossip about for one night," he said with a wry smile. "But I thank you for the offer." Abigail looked disappointed but nodded. "Another time, perhaps." "Another time," he agreed. "Good night, Abigail." "Good night, Ethan." As he walked back toward the miners' boarding house, Ethan knew that Frank Parker wouldn't let this humiliation stand. The man's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride was more dangerous than any physical injury. Something would have to be done, and soon, if Abigail was ever to know peace. For the next week, Ethan kept his distance from the silver dollar, respecting Maxwell's request. He worked his shifts at the mine, ate his meals at the boarding house, and slept with his revolver within easy reach. Of Frank Parker, there was no sign, though rumors abounded that he'd left town, that he was holed up drinking himself to death, that he was plotting revenge. Ethan saw Abigail only in passing, a glimpse on the street or through the window of the mercantile. Each time they exchanged nods, nothing more. But even those brief acknowledgments were enough to set tongues wagging throughout Leadville. On Sunday, his day off, Ethan was cleaning his revolver in the common room of the boarding house when one of the younger miners, a freckled redhead named Timothy, approached his table. "Got a message for you," Timothy said, glancing nervously at the weapon Ethan was reassembling. "From Mrs. Parker." Ethan's hands stilled. "What's the message?" She asked if you might meet her after church services, by the big pine tree near the creek. Timothy lowered his voice. "She seemed mighty anxious, Mr. Ingram." Ethan nodded, slipping the last piece of his revolver into place. "Thank you, Timothy." The boy hesitated. "There's talk around town, sir, about you and Mrs. Parker." "There's always talk," Ethan replied evenly. "Yes, but—" Timothy fidgeted. "Some of the miners who drink at the bottom dollar, they're saying Frank Parker's offering $50 to whoever teaches you a lesson." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir. And word is he's got a Winchester rifle now." "I appreciate the warning," Ethan said, genuinely thankful. "You're a good lad, Timothy." The boy beamed at the praise before scampering off. Ethan finished with his weapon, holstered it, and considered his options. If Frank was making threats openly, the situation was escalating. But what concerned him more was Abigail's request for a meeting. What could be so urgent? The church services were ending as Ethan approached the designated meeting spot. The pine tree stood apart from the others, its massive trunk and spreading branches providing shade over a small grassy area near the creek that ran behind Leadville. It was a popular spot for picnics in summer, but on this cool autumn day, it was deserted. Ethan arrived first, positioning himself with a clear view of the path from town. He didn't have to wait long before he spotted Abigail making her way toward him. dressed in her Sunday best, a modest dress of deep green that complemented her auburn hair, which was for once fully down, cascading past her shoulders in loose waves. "You came," she said, slightly breathless as she reached him. "I wasn't sure you would." "Your message sounded urgent," he replied. "Is something wrong?" Abigail glanced around nervously before speaking. "Frank came to Mrs. Wilson's last night. He was sober, which was almost more frightening than when he's drunk. He said he wants me to come home." Ethan frowned. "What did you tell him?" "That I wouldn't," she said, lifting her chin with a determination that he admired. "He didn't take it well. Said if I wasn't home by tomorrow night, he'd burn down the boarding house with me in it." "He threatened you in front of witnesses?" "No," she sighed. "He's not that foolish. He waited until we were alone in the parlor. Mrs. Wilson was in the kitchen." Abigail wrapped her arms around herself, though the day wasn't particularly cold. "I'm afraid, Ethan, not just for myself but for the other women at the boarding house." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Have you told the sheriff?" "This morning after services. He said he'd have a word with Frank, but—" She shrugged helplessly. "You know how it is. A man has the right to insist his wife live under his roof." "Not if he's threatening violence," Ethan countered. "It would be my word against his," Abigail said softly. "And in Leadville, a minor's word carries more weight than his wife's." Ethan knew she was right. The law offered little protection for women in her situation. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," she admitted, meeting his eyes directly. "That's why I wanted to see you. I thought perhaps you might have some advice." There was more than a request for advice in her gaze, Ethan realized. There was trust, and something else, something that made his heart beat faster despite the gravity of the situation. "You could leave Leadville," he suggested. "Take the stage to Denver." "With what money?" Abigail asked pragmatically. "Everything we had went into Frank's claim. What little I've saved wouldn't get me halfway to Denver, let alone help me start over there." Ethan considered this. "I have some savings. Not much, but enough for a stage ticket and a few weeks' lodging until you find work." Abigail's eyes widened. "I couldn't accept that. You've done too much for me already." "Consider it an investment in your future," he said with a small smile. She studied him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this, Ethan? Why risk so much for someone you barely know?" It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself more than once over the past weeks. "I knew someone once," he said slowly, "who needed help and didn't get it. I swore I wouldn't let that happen again if I could prevent it." Abigail seemed to sense there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Instead, she reached out tentatively and placed her hand on his arm, the touch light but electric. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." They stood like that for a moment, connected by her touch and something deeper that neither was ready to name. Finally, Ethan covered her hand with his own. "I'll speak to the stagecoach office tomorrow, find out when the next coach leaves for Denver." Abigail nodded, though a shadow of uncertainty crossed her face. "And what about you? Frank won't forget what's happened." "I can take care of myself," Ethan assured her. "That's what I'm afraid of," she whispered. "That one of you will end up dead, and either way, I couldn't bear it." Ethan was about to respond when a twig snapped somewhere behind them. Instantly alert, he stepped in front of Abigail, hand moving to his revolver. "Show yourself," he called out. After a moment, Sheriff Harrington emerged from the trees, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Parker," he nodded to Abigail before turning to Ethan. "Ingram. Didn't mean to intrude, but I need a word." "What is it, Sheriff?" Ethan asked, not relaxing his stance. Harrington glanced at Abigail. "Perhaps in private, sir." "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Mrs. Parker," Ethan insisted. The sheriff sighed heavily. "Very well. Frank Parker's been shot. He's at Doc Wilson's office and it doesn't look good." Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Shot? By whom? That's what I'm trying to determine, madam, Harrington replied, his gaze shifting meaningfully to Ethan. He was found about an hour ago behind the bottom dollar. No witnesses have come forward yet. Ethan met the sheriff's suspicious look steadily. I've been at the boarding house all morning, Sheriff. Ask any of the miners there. Timothy can confirm I left just 20 minutes ago to meet Mrs. Parker. Harrington seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. I'll do that. In the meantime, I'd advise both of you to stay available. This is a serious matter. Of course, Ethan agreed. Has Frank said anything about who shot him? He's unconscious, Harrington said. Took a bullet to the chest. Doc's not optimistic. After the sheriff left, Abigail sank down onto a nearby rock, her face pale. Do you think he'll die? She asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan knelt beside her. I don't know, but I do know you're not responsible for what happened to him. Aren't I? She questioned, looking up with tear-filled eyes. If I had just gone home like he wanted, then you might be the one fighting for your life right now, Ethan cut in firmly. Frank made his own choices, Abigail. Whatever happened to him is a consequence of those choices, not yours. She wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. What happens now? Now, Ethan said, helping her to her feet. I take you back to Mrs. Wilson's, then I'm going to find out who shot Frank Parker. Why? Abigail asked, genuinely puzzled. He's tried to hurt both of us. Why would you care who shot him? Ethan's expression was grim. Because until we know who did it and why, suspicion will fall on both of us. And in a town like Leadville, suspicion can be as dangerous as guilt. The news of Frank Parker's shooting spread through Leadville like wildfire. By evening, the facts had been embellished into a dozen different stories, each more dramatic than the last. Frank had been shot by a jealous miner over a card game. Frank had been ambushed by claim jumpers. Frank had surprised a thief trying to rob the bottom dollar. No one mentioned Ethan or Abigail directly, but the sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped when either approached made it clear that the townspeople had their own theories. Doc Wilson's prognosis remained grim. The bullet had passed through Frank's right lung and lodged near his spine. He drifted in and out of consciousness, too weak to provide any information about his attacker. Ethan spent the day discreetly asking questions around town, focusing on the miners who frequented the bottom dollar. Most were reluctant to talk, eyeing him with suspicion or outright hostility. By nightfall, he had learned little more than the sheriff likely already knew. As he made his way back to the boarding house, a figure stepped out from between two buildings, blocking his path. It was the scarred man who had accompanied Frank to the Silver Dollar that night. Evening, the man greeted him, his hand resting casually on a knife at his belt. Heard you been asking a lot of questions today. Ethan stopped, maintaining a careful distance. Just trying to understand what happened to Frank Parker, the man snorted. Sure you are, or maybe you're trying to find out if anyone saw you pull that trigger. I didn't shoot Frank, Ethan said evenly. Funny thing, the scarred man continued as if Ethan hadn't spoken. Frank was telling anyone who'd listen that he was gonna settle things with you. Then suddenly, he gets a message to meet someone behind the bottom dollar early this morning. Goes out there alone and bam, takes a bullet. Ethan's eyes narrowed. A message from whom, the scarred man shrugged. Didn't say, just that he had to go meet someone important like. And you let him go alone? Ethan asked incredulously, when he had been drinking and making threats. Frank was a grown man, the scarred man replied defensively. Besides, he was stone-cold sober yesterday, said he needed a clear head for what was coming. Ethan filed this information away. Frank sober and receiving a mysterious message shortly before being shot. Neither of those facts had been mentioned by the sheriff. Thanks for the information, Ethan said, making to move past the man. The scarred man stepped into his path again. "Not so fast, cowboy. I ain't done with you yet." "I think you are," Ethan replied, his hand hovering near his revolver. For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Then the scarred man spat on the ground and stepped aside. "This ain't over," he called as Ethan walked away. "We know you had something to do with this. You and that pretty little wife of his." Ethan ignored the taunt, his mind working through this new information. If Frank had received a message to meet someone, that person was likely the shooter or at least knew who was. He needed to tell the sheriff, but first, he needed to warn Abigail. Mrs. Wilson answered the door at the boarding house, her face tight with disapproval as she recognized Ethan. "It's past calling hours, Mr. Ingram," she informed him primly. "I understand, madam," Ethan replied, removing his hat respectfully. "But I need to speak with Mrs. Parker on an urgent matter. It concerns her husband's condition." Mrs. Wilson's expression softened slightly. "Very well. But in the parlor only, and I'll be sitting right over there with my knitting." Abigail appeared moments later, her face drawn with worry. When she saw Ethan, relief flooded her features. "I've been so concerned," she said quietly as they sat on opposite ends of the parlor sofa, Mrs. Wilson watching hawk-like from her armchair. "People have been whispering all day." In low tones, Ethan explained what he had learned from the scarred man. "Someone lured Frank behind that saloon," he concluded. "Someone he trusted enough to meet alone." Abigail frowned. "Frank didn't trust many people, especially lately. But why are you telling me this?" "Because the sheriff will want to know who might have sent that message," Ethan explained. "And because until the real shooter is found, you and I remain the most obvious suspects." "But we didn't do it," Abigail whispered fiercely. "I know that," Ethan assured her. "But Leadville is a town that likes simple answers. A wife wanting freedom from an abusive husband, a stranger who's been seen defending her. It's an easy story to believe." Abigail glanced at Mrs. Wilson, who was making a show of focusing on her knitting while clearly straining to hear their conversation. "What do we do?" "I'm going to speak to the sheriff tomorrow," Ethan said. "Tell him what I've learned. In the meantime, don't go anywhere alone. Stay here or at the Silver Dollar with people around you at all times." Abigail nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else you should know. Frank had a partner in his claim, a man named Ellis Blackwood. They had a falling out about a month ago. Ellis claimed Frank was skimming from their findings." "Why didn't you mention this before?" Ethan asked. "Because Ellis left town weeks ago," Abigail explained. "At least that's what Frank told me. Said Ellis had given up on the claim and headed back east." "Did you ever meet this Ellis?" Abigail shook her head. "Frank didn't like me talking to other men, but I heard them arguing once. Ellis sounded desperate, said Frank owed him money, that they had an agreement." "What did Frank say?" He laughed. Abigail recalled, a shadow crossing her face. "Said Ellis couldn't prove anything and should count himself lucky to walk away with his life." The parlor clock chimed 9, and Mrs. Wilson pointedly cleared her throat. "I believe visiting hours are concluded, Mr. Ingram." Ethan stood, bowing slightly to Mrs. Wilson before turning back to Abigail. "I'll speak to the sheriff about Ellis Blackwood first thing tomorrow. Try not to worry." As he walked back to his lodgings through the darkened streets, Ethan was acutely aware of the eyes that seemed to follow him from windows and doorways. Leadville was watching, waiting to see what would happen next in the drama that was unfolding. What he didn't know was that the next act would begin sooner than he expected. In the pre-dawn hours, a pounding on his door jolted Ethan from sleep. He reached for his revolver before calling out, "Who is it?" "Sheriff Harrington," came the reply. "Open up, Ingram." Ethan unlocked the door to find not only the sheriff but two deputies standing in the hallway, their expressions grim. "What's happened?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Frank Parker died an hour ago," Harrington informed him, "never regained consciousness enough to name his shooter." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry to hear that. Are you?" the sheriff asked skeptically. "From where I stand, his death solves a lot of problems for you and Mrs. Parker." "I didn't kill him, Sheriff," Ethan stated firmly, "and neither did Abigail." Harrington sighed heavily. "I've got a dead man, Ingram. A man who was publicly threatening you, whose wife you've been seen with, who you humiliated in front of half the town. What would you think if you were in my boots?" "I'd think I needed to look beyond the obvious," Ethan replied. "Did you know Frank received a message asking him to meet someone behind the bottom dollar yesterday morning?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "How do you know that?" Ethan explained his conversation with the scarred man, as well as what Abigail had told him about Ellis Blackwood. "Have you checked if Blackwood is really gone, or if he might have returned?" "I'll look into it," Harrington conceded. "But in the meantime, I need you to come with us to my office. There are questions that need answering." "Am I under arrest?" Ethan asked directly. The sheriff hesitated. "Not at this time, but I strongly suggest you cooperate or that could change." Ethan nodded, reaching for his shirt. "Let me get dressed. I'll come willingly." The sheriff's office was a small, sturdy building just off Harrison Avenue. Inside, the front room contained a desk and a couple of chairs, while the back held two cells. Ethan was directed to a hard wooden chair facing the sheriff's desk. For the next 2 hours, Harrington questioned him relentlessly about his movements on the morning of the shooting, his relationship with Abigail, and his confrontations with Frank. Ethan answered truthfully but carefully, aware that anything he said could be twisted against him. "Where were you between 5 and 6 yesterday morning?" Harrington asked for the third time. "As I've said, I was asleep at the boarding house," Ethan replied patiently. "My shift at the mine doesn't start until 7. Ask any of the men who share the room with me. And they'll all swear you were there, will they?" "They'll tell you the truth," Ethan countered, "whether that helps me or not." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then abruptly changed tack. "Tell me about your relationship with Mrs. Parker." "There is no relationship," Ethan said firmly. "I intervened when I saw a man abusing a woman in public. Everything that followed came from that one moment." "Yet you've been seen walking her home, meeting with her privately," Harrington pressed. "People talk, Ingram." "People always talk," Ethan replied. "Doesn't make what they say true." Before the sheriff could respond, the door opened, and one of the deputies entered. "Sheriff, Mrs. Parker is here. Says she needs to speak with you urgently." Harrington glanced at Ethan with suspicion before nodding. "Send her in." Abigail entered, looking pale but composed. She wore a simple dark dress, her hair neatly pinned up, every inch the grieving widow. When she saw Ethan, something flickered in her eyes, relief, perhaps, but she quickly schooled her expression. "Sheriff Harrington," she greeted him, nodding formally to Ethan. "I've come to provide information about my husband's death." "Please, sit down, Mrs. Parker," the sheriff offered, his tone noticeably gentler than it had been with Ethan. Abigail took the other chair, sitting with her back straight and hands folded in her lap. "I understand that Mr. Ingram has told you about Ellis Blackwood, my husband's former partner." He mentioned the name, Harrington acknowledged. "Said there was some dispute between them." "It was more than a dispute," Abigail corrected. "Ellis believed Frank had cheated him out of a significant silver find. He threatened Frank several times." The sheriff leaned forward. "And how do you know this if you never met the man, as Mr. Ingram tells me you claimed?" Abigail hesitated, glancing briefly at Ethan. "I may not have been entirely forthcoming. The truth is, Ellis came to our home about a month ago when Frank was out. He was desperate, said Frank had taken everything from him. He showed me papers, a deed to their claim that listed both their names, and records of silver deposits that Frank had made in his name only. Why didn't you tell this to Mr. Ingram? The sheriff asked skeptically. Because I was ashamed, Abigail admitted, her cheeks flushing. Ellis offered me money to help him get evidence against Frank. I refused, of course, but I didn't tell Frank about the visit. I was afraid of how he would react. Ethan remained silent, though his mind was racing. Was Abigail telling the truth, or was she fabricating a story to divert suspicion from them? Her expression gave nothing away. And you think this Ellis Blackwood might have shot your husband? Harrington pressed. I don't know, Abigail said softly. But this morning, as I was leaving for the mercantile, I found this pushed under my door at the boarding house. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she handed to the sheriff. Harrington unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read. He passed it to Ethan without comment. The note was brief. Justice is done. You're free now. Don't look for me. There's no signature, Ethan observed. No, Abigail agreed. But who else would send such a message? Who else would think Frank's death would free me? The sheriff rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It could be a ruse, something written by the real killer to throw suspicion elsewhere. Then why send it to me at all? Abigail challenged. Why not let suspicion fall where it might? It was a good question, and Harrington didn't have an immediate answer. Finally, he sighed heavily. I'll have my deputies ask around about Ellis Blackwood, see if anyone spotted him in town recently. He fixed both of them with a hard look. In the meantime, neither of you is to leave Leadville without my permission. Understood? They both nodded. You're free to go for now, the sheriff said, standing to indicate the interview was concluded, but don't go far. Outside the sheriff's office, Ethan and Abigail walked in silence for a moment, conscious of the curious stares that followed them down the street. That was a convenient note, Ethan said finally, keeping his voice low. Abigail glanced at him sharply. Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Ingram? The formality stung. Not at all, he replied carefully, just noting the timing. The timing of my husband's murder is hardly convenient for me, Abigail retorted. I'm now a suspect, ostracized by half the town and left with nothing but debts and painful memories. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. I'm on your side, Abigail. I just want to understand what's happening. Her expression softened. I know, I'm sorry, it's just... She glanced around at the watching townsfolk. Could we speak somewhere private? They found relative privacy in the small church, which was empty save for the pastor arranging hymnals in the back pews. He nodded to them as they entered but didn't approach, respecting their apparent need for a quiet moment. The note is real, Abigail said immediately once they were seated in a front pew, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't write it, and everything I told the sheriff about Ellis Blackwood is true. He did come to me, did show me proof that Frank was cheating him. Ethan studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. He found none. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because it shames me, she admitted, her cheeks coloring. Ellis didn't just offer me money for information. He suggested that Frank didn't deserve a wife like me, that we could leave together once he got what was rightfully his. And how did you respond? Ethan asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the unexpected pang of jealousy he felt. I told him to leave and never come back, Abigail said firmly. I may have hated what my marriage had become, but I took my vows seriously. Ethan nodded slowly. Do you think Ellis could have shot Frank? I don't know, Abigail sighed. He was angry, desperate even, but to kill a man in cold blood, I can't be sure. They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of their situation weighing heavily between them. Frank was dead, and until his killer was found, suspicion would continue to shadow them both. "What happens now?" Abigail asked finally. "With Frank gone, I have no claim to his property, no right to stay in our home even if I wanted to. His debts will probably consume what little he left behind." "You still have your job at the Silver Dollar," Ethan pointed out. "For how long?" she countered. "Half the patrons already believe I had something to do with Frank's death. How many will want to be served by a suspected murderess?" She had a point. Leadville, like most frontier towns, operated on a delicate balance of rough justice and rigid morality. A woman implicated in her husband's murder, regardless of the circumstances, would find few doors open to her. "The stage to Denver still runs twice weekly," Ethan said slowly. "Once this is resolved, if it's resolved," Abigail interrupted. "What if they never find who killed Frank? Are we to live under suspicion forever?" "Then perhaps we should find the killer ourselves," Ethan suggested. "Starting with Ellis Blackwood." Abigail's eyes widened. "How?" "The sheriff's deputies will be looking for him." "Yes, but they'll be looking in the obvious places," Ethan reasoned. "If Ellis is still in Leadville or nearby, he'll be hiding somewhere the law wouldn't think to check. And you think we can find him when the sheriff can't?" Abigail asked skeptically. "The sheriff doesn't know what we know," Ethan pointed out. "You met Ellis, spoke with him. You might notice things, remember details that could help us." Abigail considered this. There was something. When Ellis came to the house, he mentioned staying at a cabin outside town. Said it belonged to a friend who'd gone back east. "Did he say where this cabin was located?" "Not specifically." Abigail frowned, trying to recall. "But he did mention crossing Stray Horse Creek to reach it. That's north of town, maybe 5 miles. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something." "I'll ride out there tomorrow," Ethan decided. "See what I can find." Abigail shook her head. "Not alone, I'm coming with you. It could be dangerous," Ethan protested. "My husband has been murdered and I'm a suspect," Abigail replied firmly. "How could it be more dangerous than that? Besides, I might recognize something you wouldn't." Ethan saw the determination in her eyes and knew arguing would be futile. "Very well," he conceded. "But we'll need to be careful. If Ellis is there and is indeed the killer, he's already proven he's willing to use violence." "I understand the risk," Abigail assured him. "But I need to know the truth, Ethan, for my own peace of mind if nothing else." As they left the church, the pastor approached, offering condolences to Abigail for her loss. She accepted them with quiet dignity, playing the part of the grieving widow with a skill that impressed Ethan. It wasn't until they were outside again, walking back toward the boarding house, that he saw the mask slip slightly, revealing the turmoil beneath. "I should feel something more," Abigail confessed, her voice low. "Grief, perhaps, or at least regret, but all I feel is relief. And guilt for feeling relieved." She glanced at him anxiously. "Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you honest," Ethan replied gently. "Frank caused you nothing but pain these past years. It's natural to feel relief that the pain has ended." She nodded, taking comfort in his understanding. "Thank you for everything." As they reached the boarding house, Ethan noticed a group of women on the porch watching them approach, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Abigail noticed too and sighed. "It seems my welcome here may be wearing thin," she murmured. "Will you be all right?" Ethan asked, concerned. "Mrs. Wilson has been kind," Abigail assured him. "Whatever the others might think, she's made it clear I can stay as long as I need to." She glanced up at him. "Tomorrow, then, for our expedition. I'll come for you after breakfast," Ethan confirmed. "Wear something practical for riding." With a final nod, Abigail ascended the porch steps, holding her head high as she passed through the gauntlet of whispering women. Ethan waited until she was safely inside before turning away, his mind already planning for tomorrow's search. He didn't notice the figure watching from the shadows across the street, a figure who had observed their entire exchange with keen interest. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that promised warmth by noon but started with frost on the ground. Ethan had arranged for 2 horses from the livery stable, claiming a desire to inspect some unclaimed mining territory north of town. Abigail was waiting outside the boarding house when he arrived, dressed in a simple riding skirt and jacket, her hair braided and pinned up beneath a practical hat. She looked nervous but determined as she mounted the gentle mare Ethan had chosen for her. "You ride well," he observed as they set off, heading north out of town. "My father raised horses in Missouri," she explained, "before the war took everything from us." They rode mostly in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the town gave way to the rugged wilderness that surrounded it. The trail followed Stray Horse Creek for several miles, winding through stands of aspen and pine. Occasionally, they passed a small homestead or isolated miner's cabin, but as they traveled farther from Leadville, such signs of civilization became increasingly rare. "How will we know which cabin to check?" Ethan asked as they paused to rest the horses beside the creek. Abigail frowned, scanning the landscape. Ellis mentioned it was set back from the creek, with a view of Twin Peaks. She pointed to the distinctive dual summits visible to the northwest. He said it was the perfect place to lay low until he got what he wanted from Frank. They continued riding, angling northwest to keep the peaks in sight. After another mile, they spotted a thin curl of smoke rising from a stand of pines. "Someone's there," Ethan observed, reining in his horse. "Let's approach carefully." They dismounted and tethered their horses in a small clearing, then proceeded on foot through the trees. As they drew nearer, a small cabin came into view, a simple one-room structure with a stone chimney from which the smoke emanated. A lean-to addition served as a stable for a single horse, which nickered softly as they approached. Ethan motioned for Abigail to stay behind him as they crept closer. Through the cabin's single window, they could see a figure moving about inside. Ethan drew his revolver and positioned himself beside the door. "Wait here," he whispered to Abigail. "If there's trouble, run for the horses." Before she could protest, he knocked firmly on the door. The movement inside stilled, followed by the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. "Who's there?" called a man's voice, tense with suspicion. Ethan glanced at Abigail, who nodded confirmation this was Ellis Blackwood's voice. "My name's Ethan Ingram," he called back. "I'd like to talk to you about Frank Parker." A tense silence followed. Then, "Parker sent you to kill me, did he? Well, you can tell that thieving bastard I'm not going down without a fight. Frank Parker is dead," Ethan replied evenly. "Shot 3 days ago behind the Bottom Dollar Saloon." Another silence, longer this time. Finally, the door opened a crack, revealing a portion of a man's face unshaven, haggard with one bloodshot blue eye visible. "Dead? You're lying." "It's the truth," Abigail said, stepping forward into view. "Frank was murdered. The sheriff is looking for his killer." The eye widened in recognition. "Mrs. Parker." The door opened further, revealing a tall, thin man in his early 30s, his once handsome face now gaunt with stress or illness. He held a Winchester rifle pointed loosely at the ground. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for answers," she replied simply. "May we come in?" Ellis hesitated, then nodded, stepping back to allow them entry. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean: a single bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small stove for cooking and heating. Papers were spread across the table, which Ellis hastily gathered up as they entered. "Sit if you like," he offered, leaning his rifle against the wall but keeping it within easy reach. "I don't have much to offer by way of hospitality." "We didn't come for tea," Ethan said, remaining standing. "We came to find out if you killed Frank Parker." Ellis's face registered shock, followed quickly by understanding. "You think I—" He laughed hollowly. "I suppose I can't blame you. I wanted him dead many times these past weeks." His expression sobered. "But I didn't kill him, Mr. Ingram. Whatever else I am, I'm not a murderer." "Then why are you hiding up here?" Ethan challenged. "Why haven't you left the area as everyone believes you have?" Ellis sank into one of the chairs, suddenly looking exhausted. "Because Frank stole everything from me. Our claim was finally paying out rich silver ore, better than anything we'd found before. But Frank filed the claim papers in his name only, forged my signature on documents transferring my share to him. By the time I discovered the deception, he'd already sold half the claim to Eastern investors." "And you have proof of this?" Abigail asked. Ellis nodded toward the papers he'd gathered. "Everything's there. I've been gathering evidence, building a case to take to the territorial court in Denver. But I needed proof that Frank was the one who falsified the documents." "That's why you came to me," Abigail realized. "You wanted me to search for the original papers." "Yes," Ellis admitted. "I was desperate. The silver from that claim was my last chance to make something of myself." He looked up at her, regret in his eyes. "I apologize for my improper suggestions that day. It was inexcusable." Abigail acknowledged this with a small nod. "If you didn't kill Frank, why did you send me that note? Justice is done. You're free now." Ellis frowned in confusion. "What note? I haven't sent any messages to anyone." "I've been here for weeks, venturing into town only at night for supplies." Ethan and Abigail exchanged glances. If Ellis was telling the truth, and his confusion seemed genuine, then someone else had written that note. Someone else had killed Frank Parker and wanted Abigail to believe it was Ellis. "Where were you 3 mornings ago between 5 and 6 o'clock?" Ethan asked directly. "Here," Ellis replied without hesitation. "I've been ill, some kind of mountain fever, could barely get out of bed for 3 days." As if to confirm his statement, he coughed deeply, the sound rattling in his chest. Ethan studied him closely. Ellis Blackwood certainly looked ill. His face was flushed with what could be fever, his hands slightly trembling. And the cabin was isolated enough that riding to Leadville, committing murder, and returning would have been difficult for a healthy man, let alone one battling illness. "I believe you," Ethan said finally. "But the sheriff is looking for Frank's killer, and your history with him makes you a prime suspect." Ellis ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I can't go to the sheriff like this with nothing but my word against a dead man's. They'll hang me for sure." "Not if we can find the real killer," Abigail said firmly. "Do you have any idea who else might have wanted Frank dead?" Ellis laughed bitterly. "Besides half the men he cheated at cards and any husband whose wife he leered at. No, Frank wasn't exactly beloved in Leadville." "What about the men who were with him that night at the Silver Dollar?" Ethan asked. "The one with the scar and the others, do you know them?" Ellis's expression darkened. "Hired muscle. The scarred one is called Rudder. Nasty piece of work. Frank used men like that to intimidate people who got in his way." He glanced at Abigail. "No offense intended, madam." She shook her head, indicating no offense was taken. "Did Frank ever mention receiving threats? Anyone following him or watching the house?" "Not to me," Ellis replied. "But we weren't exactly on speaking terms these past weeks." They continued questioning Ellis for another hour, but he had little additional information to offer. As they prepared to leave, Ethan made a decision. "We'll keep your presence here a secret for now," he told Ellis. But if we need your testimony later, will you come forward? Ellis hesitated, then nodded. If you can find evidence that clears my name, yes. The truth about the claim needs to come out anyway. Outside, as they walked back to their horses, Abigail was quiet, deep in thought. I believe him, she said finally. He had motive, certainly, but something doesn't feel right. I agree, Ethan replied. The note troubles me. Someone wanted you to think Ellis was the killer. But who? Abigail wondered, and why? They had no answers as they mounted their horses and began the journey back to Leadville. The sun was high now, warming the crisp autumn air, but a shadow of unease had settled over them both. Someone in Leadville was a killer, and they were no closer to discovering who it might be. As they rode, Ethan found himself watching Abigail the way the sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the determined set of her jaw, the grace with which she handled her mount. Despite the circumstances, he was drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just her beauty, though she possessed that in abundance. It was her resilience, her quiet strength in the face of adversity. He was pulled from these thoughts as they crested a rise and Leadville came into view below them, smoke rising from 100 chimneys as the mining town went about its daily business, unaware of the drama unfolding in its midst. What now? Abigail asked as they approached the town limits. Now we look more closely at the men who were with Frank that night, Ethan replied. Starting with the one called Rudder. Finding Rudder proved easier than expected. The scarred man was a fixture at the bottom dollar, where he spent his days drinking and intimidating the other patrons. Ethan sent Abigail back to the boarding house with instructions to stay there while he paid a visit to the saloon. The bottom dollar was a far cry from the silver dollar where Abigail worked. It was darker, dirtier, with sawdust on the floor to soak up spilled drinks and the occasional blood from fights. The clientele was rougher, two miners at the end of their shift, drifters, men who preferred anonymity to respectability. Ethan spotted Rudder at a corner table, playing cards with two other men. He approached the bar, ordered a whiskey he didn't intend to drink, and observed. Rudder was winning, which didn't seem to improve his sour disposition. He collected his winnings with a scowl, barking at the barkeeper for another round of drinks. After half an hour of observation, Ethan had learned little beyond confirming that Rudder was indeed as unpleasant as Ellis had suggested. He was about to leave when the batwing doors swung open and Sheriff Harrington entered, accompanied by one of his deputies. The lawmen surveyed the room before making their way directly to Rudder's table. Ethan couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw Rudder's expression darken. The scarred man stood abruptly, sending his chair crashing backward. For a moment, it looked as if he might reach for the knife at his belt, but the sheriff's hand moved meaningfully to his own weapon, and Rudder thought better of it. With obvious reluctance, he followed the lawmen out of the saloon. Curious, Ethan left his untouched whiskey and slipped out after them. On the street, he saw the sheriff and his deputy escorting Rudder toward the jail. Moving parallel to them but keeping his distance, Ethan followed until they disappeared inside the sheriff's office. He was considering his next move when he spotted a familiar figure hurrying down the boardwalk. Mrs. Wilson, the boarding house proprietress, looking uncharacteristically flustered. She entered the sheriff's office without knocking. Something was happening, and Ethan needed to know what. He crossed the street and positioned himself beneath the open window of the sheriff's office, where voices drifted out into the afternoon air. Found it hidden in her dresser drawer, Mrs. Wilson was saying, her voice trembling with emotion. I wouldn't normally search a boarder's room, Sheriff, but when I saw her leaving with Mr. Ingram this morning, looking so secretive-like, well, you did the right thing bringing this to me, Mrs. Wilson, the sheriff's deep voice replied. Did Mrs. Parker say where she was going today? No, sir. But they rode north out of town. I saw them from my upstairs window. There was a pause, then the sheriff's voice again. And you're certain this is the gun that was in her room? Yes, sir. Wrapped in a cloth and tucked way back in the drawer. It gave me a terrible fright when I found it. Ethan's blood ran cold. A gun in Abigail's room. That couldn't be right. She didn't own a firearm, had never mentioned one. It's a .44 caliber, the sheriff was saying. Same as the bullet Doc Wilson dug out of Frank Parker. Rudder, you said Parker always carried a .36. Is that correct? Yes, sir, came Rudder's gravelly voice. Had it since the war, said it never failed him. So this isn't his gun, the sheriff concluded. Mrs. Wilson, I'll need you to come with me to the boarding house. Mrs. Parker and Mr. Ingram should be returning soon if they're not back already. Ethan didn't wait to hear more. He hurried back toward the boarding house, taking side streets to avoid being seen. His mind raced with implications. Someone had planted a gun in Abigail's room, the murder weapon, if the sheriff's comments were any indication. But who? And why? He reached the boarding house just as Abigail was ascending the front steps. Grabbing her arm, he pulled her around the side of the building, out of sight of the street. Ethan, she gasped, startled. What are you doing? There's no time to explain fully, he said urgently. Someone has planted the murder weapon in your room. Mrs. Wilson found it and took it to the sheriff. They're on their way here now to arrest you. Abigail's face paled. But that's impossible. I don't own a gun. I've never fired one in my life. I believe you, Ethan assured her. But the sheriff won't. Not with the evidence he has. We need to get you somewhere safe while I figure this out. Where? Abigail asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. If I run, I'll look guilty for sure. Ethan considered their options. They couldn't go back to Ellis's cabin. That would be the first place the sheriff would look once he learned of their ride north. They needed somewhere closer, somewhere they could hide temporarily until he could uncover the truth. The old Anderson mine, he decided. It's been abandoned for months, but the cabin there is still sound. It's less than an hour's ride southeast of town. Abigail hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'll need a few things from my room. There's no time, Ethan insisted, already leading her toward the back of the property where the stables stood. The sheriff could be here any minute. We need to leave now. They slipped into the stable, where their horses from the morning's ride were still saddled, not yet attended to by the stable boy. Mounting quickly, they rode out the back way, keeping to the alleys until they reached the edge of town. Only then did they urge their horses into a gallop, heading southeast toward the foothills. As they rode, Ethan explained everything he'd overheard at the sheriff's office. Abigail listened in horror, her face a mask of determination despite the tears that threatened. Someone's trying to frame me, she said when he finished. But who would do such a thing? And why? I don't know, Ethan admitted, but I intend to find out. The Anderson mine had been one of the earliest claims staked in the Leadville area, but the silver vein had played out quickly, and the property had been abandoned. The cabin, built more solidly than most, remained in reasonable condition. The roof was intact, the stone fireplace still sound. Inside, dust covered the simple furniture, but it would provide adequate shelter. Ethan built a small fire while Abigail cleaned off the table and chairs with an old cloth she found. They worked in silence, each processing the implications of what had happened. By fleeing, they had confirmed their guilt in the sheriff's eyes, making the task of proving their innocence that much harder. As dusk fell, Ethan checked the surroundings one final time before joining Abigail inside. She sat at the table, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. We can't hide forever, she said quietly. No, Ethan agreed. just long enough for me to find the real killer." "How?" Abigail asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "We have no idea who it could be or why they would want to frame me specifically." Ethan considered this. "Maybe it's not about framing you. Maybe it's about Frank." "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Ethan reasoned. "Frank was killed, but the killer went to the trouble of planting the gun in your room afterward. Why? If their only goal was to kill Frank, why not just do it and disappear?" Abigail's eyes widened with understanding. Because they wanted someone else to take the blame. They needed a scapegoat. "Exactly," Ethan nodded. "And you were the obvious choice, the abused wife who'd recently left her husband. No one would question your motive." "But that still doesn't tell us who the killer is," Abigail pointed out. "No," Ethan admitted. "But it narrows the field. It would have to be someone who knew Frank well enough to lure him behind the bottom dollar that morning. Someone who knew where you were staying and could access your room to plant the gun." They fell silent, contemplating these parameters. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the cabin's walls. "You should try to rest," Ethan said finally. "Take the bed, I'll keep watch." Abigail looked ready to protest, but then nodded, the exhaustion of the day catching up with her. She moved to the simple cot in the corner, lying down fully clothed atop the musty blanket. Ethan sat by the fire, his revolver across his knee, listening to the night sounds outside. His mind worked through the puzzle pieces, trying to make sense of what they knew. Who had killed Frank Parker? Who had written the note to Abigail, trying to implicate Ellis Blackwood? Who had planted the gun in her room? The answers eluded him, but one thing was certain: they needed more information. And to get it, he would have to return to Leadville, right under the sheriff's nose. Decision made, he stood quietly and approached the bed. Abigail wasn't asleep. Her eyes opened as he neared. "I need to go back to town," he told her softly, "to find answers." "It's too dangerous," she protested, sitting up. "They'll be watching for you." "Which is why you're staying here," Ethan replied firmly. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll be back by dawn." Abigail grabbed his hand. "Be careful, Ethan. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." Their eyes met in the dim firelight, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first encounter on Leadville's dusty street. Without thinking, Ethan leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle kiss that conveyed everything he couldn't put into words. When he pulled back, Abigail's eyes were wide with surprise, but she didn't look away. "Come back to me," she whispered. "I will," he promised. The ride back to Leadville was cold and dark, with only a sliver of moon to light the way. Ethan approached from the south, tethering his horse in a stand of trees at the edge of town. On foot, he made his way through the shadows, avoiding the main streets where the sheriff might have posted watchers. His first destination was the Silver Dollar. Maxwell, the owner, might have information, and Ethan judged him to be a man who valued truth over gossip. The saloon was quieter than usual when Ethan slipped in through the back entrance, the patrons subdued by the recent violence in their midst. Maxwell was behind the bar, polishing glasses. He glanced up as Ethan approached from the back hallway, his eyes widening in recognition. Without a word, he nodded toward his office door. Ethan followed him inside. "You're a damn fool coming back here," Maxwell said once the door was closed. "The sheriff's got men watching every road out of town." "I need information," Ethan replied simply. "About Frank Parker's movements the day he was killed." Maxwell sighed, settling his bulk into a chair behind his desk. "Word is you and the widow Parker are in it together, that you killed Frank so you could have her all to yourself." "That's not what happened," Ethan stated firmly. "Didn't figure it was," Maxwell nodded. "You don't strike me as the murdering type, and Abigail, Well, she's had plenty of chances to leave Frank if she wanted to. Do you know who Frank was meeting that morning? Ethan asked directly. Maxwell frowned. Meeting? First I've heard of it. He received a message the night before asking him to meet someone behind the bottom dollar at dawn, Ethan explained. Rudder mentioned it. Rudder's a snake, Maxwell spat. Wouldn't trust him to tell me if my coat was on fire. He considered for a moment. But now that you mention it, Frank did get a note the night before he died. He was here at his usual table. One of the girls brought it to him. Which girl? Ethan pressed. Lucy, I think. Young thing, not been working here long. Is she here tonight? Maxwell nodded. Serving tables in the back room. But listen, Ingram, you need to be careful. The sheriff's got it in his head that you're guilty, and he's not a man who changes his mind easily. Ethan thanked him and slipped back into the main saloon, making his way to the back room where the private card games were held. He spotted Lucy immediately, a petite blonde girl, barely out of her teens, serving drinks to a table of well-dressed businessmen. He waited until she headed back to the bar for refills, then intercepted her in the hallway. She gasped in surprise, nearly dropping her tray. You're him, she whispered, eyes wide. The one they're looking for. I need to ask you about the night before Frank Parker was killed, Ethan said quickly. You brought him a note. Do you remember who gave it to you? Lucy glanced nervously over her shoulder. I could get in trouble. Please, Ethan urged. A woman's life depends on it. The girl bit her lip, then nodded. It was a man I didn't recognize, respectable looking with a fancy Eastern suit, paid me a silver dollar to deliver the note and not say who it was from. What did he look like? Young, old, any distinctive features? Lucy frowned in concentration. Middle-aged, I'd say, dark hair going gray at the temples, had a scar on his chin right here. She touched her own chin. And a watch chain with some kind of fancy charm on it. A bird, I think. Ethan committed these details to memory. Thank you, Lucy. You've been very helpful. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted in the main room, raised voices, the sound of chairs scraping back. Lucy paled. It's the sheriff. Someone must have seen you come in. Is there another way out? Ethan asked urgently. Lucy pointed to a door at the end of the hallway. Storage room. There's a window that opens into the alley. Ethan thanked her again and hurried to the door, slipping into the cluttered storage room just as heavy footsteps entered the hallway. He located the window small, but large enough for him to squeeze through with some effort. As he dropped into the alley, he heard the storage room door bang open behind him. He came through here, someone shouted. Check the alley. Ethan ran, dodging between buildings, using the darkness to his advantage. He could hear pursuit, multiple men shouting to each other as they searched. He needed to get out of town, back to Abigail at the Anderson mine. But first, he had one more stop to make. The bottom dollar was less crowded than the silver dollar, its patrons more interested in serious drinking than socializing. Ethan entered cautiously, keeping to the shadows. He spotted Rudder at his usual table, playing cards, seemingly unconcerned that he had been questioned by the sheriff earlier that day. Moving quietly through the room, Ethan positioned himself behind the scarred man, listening to the conversation at the table. Fool sheriff thinks the woman did it, Rudder was saying, his voice slurred with drink. Wouldn't know a real killer if one spit in his eye. His companions laughed, though there was an edge to it, an uncertainty. You seem mighty sure about that, Rudder, one commented. You know something the rest of us don't. Rudder leaned back in his chair, a smirk twisting his scarred face. Maybe I do. Maybe I was paid good money to keep my mouth shut about what I know. Paid by who? Another man asked. Wouldn't you like to know? Rudder taunted. Let's just say some folks in this town ain't who they pretend to be. Some got secrets worth killing to keep. Ethan had heard enough. He slipped back out into the night, his mind racing with new possibilities. Rudder knew something had perhaps been paid to stay quiet about what he knew. Could he have been the one who killed Frank? Or was he merely a tool used by someone else? The description Lucy had given didn't match Rudder. The scarred man was rough-looking, unrefined, nothing like the respectable Eastern gentleman she had described. But Rudder clearly had information, and Ethan needed to know what it was. He was considering how to approach Rudder when the man himself staggered out of the bottom dollar, heading down a side street toward what Ethan knew was a cheap boarding house frequented by drifters. This was his chance. Ethan followed at a distance, waiting until Rudder turned into a narrow alley before making his move. He caught up to the scarred man in 3 long strides, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall of a building. "What do you know about Frank Parker's murder?" Ethan demanded, pressing his forearm against Rudder's throat. Rudder's eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with malice. Well, if it ain't the lady killer himself. Sheriff's got half the town looking for you, Ingram." "Answer the question," Ethan pressed harder. "Who paid you to keep quiet? Was it the man with the scar on his chin? The one with the bird charm on his watch?" A flicker of surprise crossed Rudder's face before he could mask it. "Don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Ethan insisted. "You were with Frank the night before he died. You saw who delivered that note." Rudder struggled, but Ethan had the advantage of sobriety and determination. All right," he gasped as Ethan's arm pressed harder against his windpipe. "I saw him. Eastern fellow, just like you said. Had some kind of fancy bird thing on his watch chain." "Who is he?" Ethan demanded. "Don't know his name," Rudder wheezed, "but he's been in town a couple weeks, staying at the Grand Hotel, calls himself a mining investor or some such. And he paid you to keep quiet." Rudder nodded, his scarred face twisted with resentment. $50 to forget I ever saw him talking to Frank. Another $50 to tell the sheriff I suspected Frank's wife might have done it. Ethan felt a surge of anger. This man had helped frame Abigail, had contributed to the circumstances that now had her hiding in an abandoned cabin, afraid for her life. It took all his self-control not to drive his fist into Rudder's face. "What else do you know?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Nothing, I swear," Rudder insisted. "The man approached me the night after Frank was killed, said he knew I was there when Frank got the note, that it would be worth my while to forget about it. And you just took the money, no questions asked." Rudder shrugged as best he could in Ethan's grip. "Money's money. Didn't figure it was my business why someone wanted Frank dead. Man had enemies enough." Ethan released him abruptly. Rudder slumped against the wall, rubbing his throat. "You gonna kill me now?" he asked, a note of fear creeping into his voice. "No," Ethan replied coldly. "But you're going to tell the sheriff everything you just told me. Tomorrow morning, first thing," Rudder snorted. "Like hell I will." "You will," Ethan assured him. "Because if you don't, I'll find you, and next time I won't be so gentle." He turned to leave, but Rudder's voice stopped him. "There's something else. Something I heard Frank say to the Eastern man the first time they met." Ethan looked back. "What?" "Frank called him James, said something like, 'I never thought I'd see you again after St. Louis.'" Rudder's scarred lip curled in a humorless smile. "Figured you might find that interesting. St. Louis." The name triggered something in Ethan's memory. Hadn't Abigail mentioned coming from Missouri? Could this Eastern man, this James, have some connection to Abigail's past? He needed to get back to her, to share what he'd learned and see if the name meant anything to her. But as he turned to leave the alley, a familiar voice called out from behind him. "That's far enough, Ingram." Sheriff Harrington stood at the alley's entrance, his revolver drawn and pointed steadily at Ethan's chest. Behind him, 2 deputies waited, weapons also at the ready. "You've led us on quite a chase," the sheriff continued, stepping forward cautiously. "But it ends now. Where's Mrs. Parker?" "Safe," Ethan replied, mentally calculating his options. 3 armed men in a narrow alley, not odds he liked. "She's a suspect in her husband's murder," Harrington stated. "And you're now wanted for aiding and abetting, possibly as an accomplice." "She didn't kill Frank," Ethan said firmly. "Neither did I. The real killer is a man staying at the Grand Hotel, an Eastern investor with a scar on his chin and a bird charm on his watch chain." The sheriff's expression didn't change. "That's quite a story. You can tell it to the judge when you're arraigned." He gestured with his revolver. "Now hands up, nice and slow." Ethan raised his hands, his mind racing. He couldn't let them take him, not when Abigail was alone and vulnerable, not when the real killer was still free. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "I can prove what I'm saying, but I need time." "You've had time," Harrington replied unsympathetically. "All you've done is run, which doesn't speak well to your innocence." "Listen to him, Sheriff," Rudder spoke up unexpectedly from behind Ethan. "He's telling the truth about the Eastern man. I saw him too." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You never mentioned this before, Rudder." "I was paid not to," Rudder admitted sullenly. "But I ain't taking the fall for murder, not even for $50. Harrington looked between the 2 men, uncertainty flickering across his weathered face. Finally, he sighed heavily. "All right, Ingram. You've got until noon tomorrow to bring me this Eastern man. After that, I'm putting out a territory-wide warrant for you and Mrs. Parker." He lowered his weapon slightly. "And Rudder comes with me now to give a full statement." Rudder began to protest, but a look from the sheriff silenced him. As the deputies took Rudder into custody, Harrington turned back to Ethan. "Don't make me regret this, son. Noon tomorrow, not a minute later." With that, he and his deputies led Rudder away, leaving Ethan alone in the alley. He sagged against the wall, the tension of the confrontation draining from him. The sheriff's reluctant reprieve was more than he'd hoped for, but it still left them with precious little time to uncover the truth. He needed to return to Abigail, to see if the name James and the connection to St. Louis meant anything to her. And then, somehow, they needed to identify and confront this mysterious Eastern man before noon tomorrow. The ride back to the Anderson mine seemed longer than before, fatigue and worry weighing Ethan down. Dawn was breaking as he approached the cabin, the first pale light of day spilling over the mountains to the east. He approached cautiously, alert for any sign that someone might have discovered Abigail's hiding place. But all seemed peaceful, no tracks in the dirt around the cabin, no sign of disturbance. "Abigail," he called softly as he reached the door. "It's Ethan." The door opened immediately, revealing Abigail's anxious face. She pulled him inside and threw her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "I was so worried," she murmured against his chest, "when dawn came and you weren't back." Ethan held her close, savoring the warmth of her body against his despite the urgency of their situation. "I'm all right," he assured her, "but we don't have much time." He led her to the table and told her everything he'd learned about the mysterious Eastern man, about Rudder's confession, about the sheriff's deadline. Abigail listened intently, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "James from St. Louis," she repeated when he finished. "It could be, but that's impossible." "What?" Ethan pressed. "Who is he, Abigail?" She rose from the table, pacing the small cabin as she gathered her thoughts. "When I was 16 in St. Louis, there was a man, James Harwood. He worked for my father, helping manage our horse farm. He was older, perhaps 30 then, and very charming." She paused, a flush coloring her cheeks. "He paid me special attention, made me feel important. I was flattered, naive." "What happened?" Ethan asked gently. "My father caught him stealing, falsifying sales records, pocketing the difference." There was a confrontation. James struck my father, who fell and hit his head." Her voice broke. "He died 3 days later." Ethan's heart sank. "And James, was he arrested?" Abigail shook her head. "He fled before the authorities could be notified. I testified against him in absentia, but they never found him." She looked up, her eyes wide with sudden realization. "He had a scar on his chin from a horse kick, he told me, and he always wore a watch chain with a falcon charm. It was his family crest, he claimed." "It's him," Ethan said with certainty. "But why would he kill Frank? And why try to frame you for it?" "Revenge," Abigail whispered. "My testimony ensured he'd be hanged if caught. He lost everything because of me." Ethan considered this. "But how did he find you? And what was his connection to Frank?" Abigail resumed her pacing, piecing together the puzzle. "Frank and I met in St. Louis after my father's death. We came west together 2 years later. Perhaps James tracked us from there." She stopped suddenly. "The mining investors Frank was working with, he never told me their names, but he mentioned they were from back east. What if James is one of them?" It made a terrible kind of sense. James Harwood, now using a different name perhaps, posing as a mining investor to get close to Frank Parker, and by extension to Abigail. He could have learned about their troubled marriage, seen an opportunity for the perfect revenge. Kill Frank and frame Abigail, destroying her life as she had once destroyed his. "We need to find him," Ethan said, standing. "Confront him with what we know." "And then what?" Abigail asked. "It's our word against his. We have no proof." Ethan thought for a moment. "The gun. If he planted it in your room, his fingerprints might be on it." "But the sheriff has the gun now," Abigail pointed out. "Then we need to make James confess," Ethan decided. "And we need witnesses to that confession." As they rode back toward Leadville, Ethan outlined his plan. It was dangerous, relying on timing and James Harwood's own arrogance, but it was the only chance they had to clear Abigail's name before the sheriff's deadline. The Grand Hotel was the finest establishment in Leadville, catering to wealthy mine owners and Eastern investors. Ethan and Abigail approached separately, Abigail from the front, wearing a borrowed shawl pulled low over her face, and Ethan from the service entrance at the back. The desk clerk was initially reluctant to provide information about guests, but when Abigail mentioned an investment opportunity involving the late Frank Parker's silver claim, his attitude changed. Yes, there was a Mr. James Thornfield staying in room 214, an investor from Philadelphia. Yes, he had been in town for about 2 weeks. And yes, he had indeed been involved in discussions with the late Mr. Parker regarding his silver claim. Abigail thanked him and moved to a sitting area in the lobby to wait, her heart pounding with nervousness and anticipation. Meanwhile, Ethan made his way upstairs via the service stairs, careful to avoid being seen by hotel staff or guests. Room 214 was at the end of the hallway on the second floor. Ethan listened at the door for any sound of movement inside. Hearing nothing, he tried the handle locked as expected. Using skills acquired during a misspent youth that he rarely acknowledged, he picked the lock quietly and slipped inside. The room was well appointed, with heavy curtains, a large 4-poster bed, and a writing desk by the window. Ethan searched quickly but thoroughly, looking for anything that might connect James Thornfield to Frank's murder or to Abigail's past. In the wardrobe, he found expensive suits and shirts, a pair of polished boots, and a locked document case. The lock on the case proved more challenging than the door, but eventually yielded to his persistent efforts. Inside were papers, investment documents, letters, and at the bottom, a small leather-bound book that appeared to be a personal journal. Ethan flipped through it quickly, his eye caught by an entry from 3 weeks earlier. "Finally located Parker and his wife in Leadville. The fool doesn't recognize me, why would he? We met only briefly in St. Louis, and I was careful to keep my connection to Abigail hidden then. She, however, will know me instantly. I must move carefully. Another entry, dated just before Frank's murder. Parker is more gullible than I hoped. Believes I'm ready to invest heavily in his claim, despite Ellis Blackwood's warnings about his character. Blackwood has proven a nuisance too clever by half. Had to arrange for his departure from the scene. And finally, an entry from the day of the murder. It is done. Parker will trouble this world no more. The weapon is placed where it will be found when the time is right. Soon Abigail will know what it is to lose everything, to be hunted and despised. My revenge will be complete. Ethan's hand tightened on the journal. Here was the proof they needed. James Thornfield, or Harwood, had admitted his guilt in his own hand. He tucked the journal inside his coat and continued searching, finding in the desk drawer a pocket watch with a falcon charm on its chain. He was about to leave when he heard voices in the hallway, one a hotel employee, the other deeper, more cultured, approaching the room. There was no time to reach the door. Instead, Ethan moved quickly behind the heavy curtains by the window, concealing himself just as a key turned in the lock. "Appreciate your attention to detail," the cultured voice was saying as the door opened. "Please have my shirts pressed and returned by this evening." "Of course, Mr. Thornfield," replied the hotel employee. "Will there be anything else, sir?" "No, that will be all, thank you." The door closed, and Ethan heard the sound of movement in the room, footsteps, the clink of a glass, the creak of a chair. Through a slight gap in the curtains, he could see a man seated at the desk, dark hair graying at the temples, an air of refined confidence about him. As the man turned slightly to reach for something, Ethan caught sight of the scar on his chin, a thin, white line about an inch long. James Thornfield, formerly Harwood, opened the desk drawer and suddenly froze, his body tensing. "Who's been in here?" he muttered, rummaging through the drawer more frantically. "The watch. Where is it?" He stood abruptly, moving to the wardrobe, yanking it open. "The case," he hissed as he discovered the document case, now unlocked and disturbed. "The journal." In that moment, a knock sounded at the door. Thornfield composed himself quickly, straightening his jacket before answering. "Yes, Mr. Thornfield." It was Abigail's voice, slightly muffled through the door. "My name is Mrs. Wilson. I understand you were acquainted with my late brother, Frank Parker." There was a pause, then Thornfield replied, his voice controlled once more. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure, Mrs. Wilson. How may I assist you?" "It concerns his silver claim," Abigail continued. "I've recently inherited it, and I'm told you were interested in investing. May I come in?" Another pause, longer this time. Ethan tensed behind the curtain, his hand moving to his revolver, if Thornfield recognized Abigail's voice. "Of course," Thornfield said finally. "Please enter." The door opened, and Abigail stepped inside, still wearing the shawl that partially obscured her face. Ethan could see her through the gap in the curtains, her posture straight, her movements controlled despite what must have been tremendous fear. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I know how busy, important men such as yourself must be." Thornfield gestured to a chair. "Please sit. I must admit, I wasn't aware Frank Parker had a sister." "Half-sister," Abigail corrected smoothly, taking the offered seat. "Different mothers. We weren't close until recently." She lowered her shawl, revealing her face. "In fact, I believe you knew my father, Mr. Harwood, Jonathan Parker of St. Louis." Thornfield's composure slipped for just an instant, his eyes widening in shock before he recovered. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, madam. My name is James Thornfield of Philadelphia. I've never been to St. Louis." "Haven't you?" Abigail challenged, rising from her chair. That's strange, because I remember you quite clearly, James. I remember how you charmed my father, gained his trust. I remember how you stole from him and how you struck him down when he confronted you. I remember everything. Thornfield's face hardened, the pretense of civility dropping away. Abigail Parker, he said, her name like a curse on his lips. I wondered when you would show yourself. Tired of hiding already. I'm not hiding anymore, Abigail replied firmly. I know what you did. You killed Frank to get revenge on me. Thornfield laughed, a cold sound devoid of humor. Frank was nothing, a means to an end. Killing him was merely convenient. Watching you hang for his murder, that will be my true revenge. It won't happen, Abigail stated. The sheriff knows about you now. He knows to look for a man with a scar on his chin and a falcon watch charm. Something dangerous flickered in Thornfield's eyes. Does he? Well, that is unfortunate. He moved toward her slowly. For you, that is, because now I'll have to leave Leadville sooner than planned, but not before I finish what I started. In one swift movement, he drew a small derringer from his pocket. A shame, really. I had hoped to watch justice served in a more official capacity, but this will have to do. Ethan stepped out from behind the curtain, his revolver aimed at Thornfield's chest. Drop it, he commanded. Thornfield spun around, startled but quick-witted. Mr. Ingram, I presume, he said, his derringer now pointed at Ethan. The gallant protector, how touching. It's over, Thornfield, Ethan said. Or should I call you Harwood? We have your journal. Your confession is written in your own hand. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Thornfield's face. A clever bluff. No bluff, Ethan countered, pulling the journal from his coat with his free hand. Every detail, how you found Frank and Abigail, how you planned the murder, how you planted the weapon to frame her. It's all here. Thornfield's expression contorted with rage. Give me that. He lunged forward, derringer still raised. Ethan sidestepped, bringing the butt of his revolver down hard on Thornfield's wrist. The derringer clattered to the floor. Thornfield, more agile than his refined appearance suggested, drove his shoulder into Ethan's midsection, sending them both crashing into the writing desk. The journal flew from Ethan's hand as he grappled with Thornfield, who fought with the desperate strength of a man who knew capture meant the gallows. They struggled across the room, upending a chair, shattering a water pitcher. Abigail darted forward, retrieving the fallen journal and derringer. Stop, both of you, she commanded, pointing the derringer at Thornfield. The men froze, Ethan with his arm locked around Thornfield's neck, Thornfield with his fingers clawing at Ethan's grip. It's over, James, Abigail said firmly. The sheriff will be here any moment. As if summoned by her words, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, followed by a pounding on the door. Thornfield, Sheriff Harrington. Open up. Thornfield's body sagged in defeat. Ethan released him cautiously, retrieving his dropped revolver and keeping it trained on the man as he opened the door to admit the sheriff and his deputies. Perfect timing, Sheriff, Ethan said, gesturing to the disheveled Thornfield. We were just discussing Frank Parker's murder with Mr. Thornfield here, or should I say, James Harwood. Harrington surveyed the scene, the overturned furniture, Abigail holding the derringer, Thornfield's murderous glare. I take it you found your proof. Abigail held out the journal. It's all here, Sheriff. His confession in his own hand. As the deputies took Thornfield into custody, the Eastern man fixed Abigail with a look of pure hatred. This isn't over, he hissed. Not while I draw breath. Yes, it is, Ethan countered, stepping protectively in front of Abigail. Your revenge failed, Harwood. You'll hang for what you've done, and Abigail will be free to live her life without the shadow of your hatred. Thornfield said nothing more as he was led away, his refined facade crumbling to reveal the bitter, vengeful man beneath. After providing detailed statements to the sheriff, Ethan and Abigail left the Grand Hotel together, stepping into the bright sunshine of a Leadville afternoon. The town seemed different, somehow still rough, still wild, but no longer threatening. "What happens now?" Abigail asked as they walked slowly down Harrison Avenue, no longer concerned with being seen together. "That depends," Ethan replied, glancing down at her. "What do you want to happen?" Abigail considered this. "I've spent so long just trying to survive, I've hardly thought about what I want." She looked up at him, a small smile touching her lips. "But I know I don't want to leave Leadville, not yet anyway." "Because of your job at the Silver Dollar?" Ethan asked. "Because of you," she replied simply. "If you're staying, that is." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. People passed them on the boardwalk, some nodding in acknowledgement now that their names had been cleared, others still wary of the couple at the center of Leadville's most dramatic murder case in years. "I'm staying," he assured her, taking her hands in his. "For as long as you'll have me." Abigail's smile widened. "That might be a very long time, Mr. Ingram." "I'm counting on it, Mrs. Parker." In the days that followed, James Thornfield, revealed to be the fugitive James Harwood, was charged with the murder of Frank Parker. The evidence was overwhelming: his journal, the testimony of Rudder and Lucy from the Silver Dollar, and eventually, a full confession when Harwood realized the futility of denial. Ellis Blackwood came forward with his evidence about Frank's fraudulent dealings, and the territorial court awarded him his rightful share of the silver claim. True to his word, he compensated Abigail for her help, providing her with enough money to start fresh. She chose to remain at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, though she moved to a larger room now that she could afford it. Her position at the Silver Dollar continued, but Maxwell promoted her to hostess, a more respectable role that kept her behind the bar rather than serving tables. Ethan stayed on at the mine, saving his earnings with a purpose in mind. He called on Abigail properly now, under Mrs. Wilson's watchful but approving eye. They took Sunday walks together, attended church services side by side, and slowly, the scandal that had once surrounded them faded into just another tale in Leadville's colorful history. 6 months after the events that had brought them together, on a crisp spring day with the mountains still capped in snow but wildflowers beginning to bloom in the valleys, Ethan took Abigail on a picnic to their spot by the pine tree near the creek. "I have something to ask you," he said as they sat together on a blanket, the remains of their meal packed away. Abigail looked at him expectantly, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as it danced in the gentle breeze. "Yes." Ethan took her hand, his usual confidence momentarily deserting him. "These past months have been the happiest of my life, despite everything we've been through. Or maybe because of it." He paused, gathering his courage. "I love you, Abigail. I think I have since that first day when I saw you in the street and couldn't just stand by." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. "I love you too, Ethan. More than I thought possible." From his pocket, Ethan withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring with a small diamond that caught the light. "Abigail Parker, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, with all my heart." They were married 2 weeks later in Leadville's small church with half the town in attendance. Ellis Blackwood, now a successful mine owner in his own right, gave the bride away. Mrs. Wilson wept openly, claiming she'd known all along they were destined for each other. Even Sheriff Harrington attended, offering gruff congratulations and a bottle of fine whiskey as a wedding gift. As husband and wife, they purchased a small house on the edge of town, with a view of the mountains and room for a garden. Ethan continued his work at the mine, eventually becoming a supervisor as his knowledge and reliability earned him promotions. Abigail left her position at the Silver Dollar to focus on their home, and, within a year, the arrival of their first child, a son they named Jonathan, after Abigail's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, bringing more joy to a home already filled with love. As their children grew, Ethan and Abigail often recounted the story of how they met, though the more dramatic elements were saved for when young ears weren't present. "You ever regret it?" Abigail asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple. Their children were asleep inside, the town of Leadville spread out below them, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "Regret what?" Ethan asked, his arm around her shoulders, holding her close against the evening chill, stepping in that day, risking everything for a woman you didn't even know. Ethan turned to look at her, still struck by her beauty after all these years. "Not for a single moment," he replied honestly. "It was the best decision I ever made." Abigail smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Mine too," she whispered. And as the last light of day faded from the Colorado sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, secure in the knowledge that the love born in the chaos and violence of their first meeting had grown into something enduring and true, a testament to the fact that even in the wild and unforgiving world of the frontier, hope and second chances could flourish. The end.